Welcome to the second part of my conversation with Ed Stanton about his novel Frail Blood. In this part, we discuss the value of an outsider's perspective and of historical comparisons. If you're enjoying the conversation, please leave us a like and subscribe to the channel. So, this is the second part of my discussion with Ed Stanton. If you didn't see the first part, I do suggest listening to and watching that part first. But, in the first part of our discussion, we talked a lot about Argentina, not so much about the protagonist, who, of course, as you mentioned, is American. And I think the relationship between the two countries, the two kind of cultural milieux is quite interesting. So Robert is an American who brings an outsider's perspective, and he writes about Argentina as a journalist, despite having only just arrived. And, unsurprisingly, when locals come to realize this, particularly as he's getting involved in the politics, that elicits some criticism. What are your own thoughts about writing as an outsider in general? And also, how does this inform your own writing of fiction, would you say?
Yeah, I think I've done a lot of traveling, especially in Spain and Latin America. Those have been the two areas that I've traveled to and written about most. And to start out, I'd say that the famous words by Nietzsche, that you have to leave your own country to understand it, right? So I've learned a lot about my own country by leaving it, by going to other countries that are quite different, Spain and Latin America. The border between the U.S. and Mexico, I call it the most radical border in the world, right? Because you have an Anglo-Saxon culture, basically, and a Hispanic culture that are right next to each other, cheek by jowl. I don't think there's any border that I know of in the world that is quite that radically different. So I was always drawn to that difference. And as far as being an outsider, when I traveled to Argentina, I was lucky enough to receive a Fulbright grant for both Argentina and Uruguay in 1990, the very time the novel takes place. So I spent quite a bit of time in both countries, lecturing, traveling, and in Argentina, I met a porteña, a woman from Buenos Aires, with whom I fell in love. She was very much connected to the cultural literary world. So I got to meet people not only in that world, artists, painters, sculptors, poets, novelists, writers. I met Maria Kodama, Borges' widow, for example. So I was lucky to meet many people that I would not have met without that connection. It's been said the best way to learn a foreign language is to fall in love with the person who lives in that country. The best way to get to know a country is also by, that kind of intimate relationship. So that's what happens to Robert. And he meets people that he wouldn't have met otherwise. And he sees places and situations that would have been impossible for him to see otherwise. So the scene toward the end of the novel when Gabriela goes to see this seer, this clairvoyante, this woman who, through the cards, kind of not a tarot deck, but a Spanish deck of cards, kind of tells the future. In this decaying part of the outskirts of Buenos Aires, that's the kind of thing that he would not have been able to see if it hadn't been for this connection with Gabriela, right? And yes, Robert is a journalist, and he is a specialist in Latin America. If he had stayed back in Los Angeles, he would have become the bureau chief of Latin America for the Los Angeles Times, one of the best newspapers in the country, and the one that is in the most Hispanic area of the United States, right? Los Angeles has more Mexicans than any city in the world except Mexico City, more than Guadalajara, more than Monterrey, Puebla, etc. So what I'm saying is he's not all that new, right? He's not all that fresh, or he's not all that uninformed about Latin America. He knows the language. And sometimes first impressions can be interesting. And once you become used to a place, you don't see things that you noticed in the beginning. You go native, right? And so I like to think about another newspaper, the New York Times, which has a policy of when they send a new bureau chief to a city, let's say Buenos Aires. Obviously, that person has knowledge of the language, history of the culture, maybe the country, but that person stays on site for just a few years. And then the New York Times pulls that person because they don't want them to lose that freshness. They don't want them to lose that objectivity. They don't want them to go native, right? So I try to make Robert someone who is quite informed and gets to know Argentine life, especially the life of Buenos Aires, quite well, quite quickly. But he also has a certain kind of American innocence that Gabriela does not have. And this is a tension, I think, in the love affair and in the novel, that as an Argentine who has lived through the military dictatorship, who has seen so much suffering, who has seen the terrible inflation, who's seen the poverty, the misery. And Robert, who is a middle-class American journalist, tends to be much more naive and not realize the danger that he's getting in by falling in love with this woman whose father is complicit with the regime and who wants at all costs not for her daughter to marry an outsider who is divorced. That's his first sin, right? And who doesn't belong to this very privileged Anglo-Argentine social economic class in Buenos Aires, right? So that's kind of the way I saw the role of the outsider there, as an outsider who is not just a plain outsider. He's an informed outsider, but he's still an American, and his optimism kind of clashes with the very hard-boiled and cynical realism of Cesar, of Gabriela's father, for example. Am I forgetting part of the question? I can't remember. Does that answer it?
I think it does. And it also takes us on nicely to the next one, I think, because you talked about Robert as having this American innocence, as somebody arriving in Argentina, but, he's an aspect of his life that we haven't mentioned yet is he's a Vietnam War veteran. And this comes up a number of times as a sort of point of reference for him personally, but it also comes up as a kind of point of comparison with events in Argentina. And, this is one key scene where he's getting into this argument with Gabriela's father, and it becomes this kind of unproductive comparative history where they're just sort of scoring points of each other about the respective atrocities committed by their governments. So, as a question, what do you think, how can we get to a more, I suppose, productive form of historical comparison? Is fiction playing a role in that, do you think? And I suppose as a character, did you have a sense of how those experiences of Vietnam also influenced Robert's outlook in a completely different part of the world as well?
Yeah, that's another difficult question. Yeah, your questions are challenging and not easy, Yvonne. I appreciate that. Robert is a veteran of one war that he considers to have been unjust. He also evokes memories of seeing his comrades in arms blasted, killed. He also is the son of a veteran who fought in World War II, a war that he considers to have been just. And he recalls the times that he had to aim or shoot at Viet Cong or North Vietnamese with some guilt. So he's not a warmonger, but he believes in just wars. And then his opponent in the novel, his antagonist, is Cesar Rocastillo, who has also been involved. He's also a veteran in a sense, not that he wore a uniform, but he's a veteran of that experience of the military dictatorship. And we know that he was actively involved in negotiating with the opposition, with the left, if you want to put it that way, for the release of prisoners, this kind of thing, that he was very brave, that we see another side of him that we might not suspect. He sees the war that he's been involved in as being a just war, right? And he, in fact, believes in wars that can be just. And at one point, he says, all wars are dirty, but some are dirtier than others. And so I wanted both characters to be veterans of war in some sense, but I wanted to make Robert one who was a reluctant veteran of war, who knew what an unjust war was like, who had lost friends and comrades in arms, and Cesar, who has also participated in a war that he considers to have been just, but which the record of history and most studies and research since then have shown not to be an equal war between two sides, but rather a campaign of state terrorism, right? There's no sense of remorse or no sense of repentance on the part of Cesar. And when you deal with that kind of conviction, right, it's very difficult to establish a dialogue. And it only can happen, I think it could happen much more in fiction than it can in the real world. Think about what's happening in the United States, the polarization of the United States right now. It's always a difficult question. Do you, as we say in American baseball parlance, do you play hardball against hardball, or do you play softball against hardball, right? It's hard when you're getting hardballs thrown at you to respond with softballs, right? And that's kind of the dilemma. I don't have a solution for it, but all I can say is that through fiction, we can show those conflicts and those nuances of the issue much more convincingly and in a much more complicated, complex way than we can through nonfiction.
While we're on hardball, I mean, the same character, Cesar, Gabriela's father, talks at times about the necessity of violence. And this is, one of his justifications, his primary justification, that the violence was necessary to prevent, further violence or chaos. But then Robert himself feels compelled to use force as a means of defending himself, those he cares about eventually. So, in a sense, it's a more extreme version of what you just said. You respond to hardball with hardball. Is this a sort of downward spiral that has no escape? Is it a result of the kind of fabric of society having been damaged, or is there more individual choice involved in this? And is this kind of escalation of violence, whether discursive and verbal, or whether actually physical, is it avoidable, do you think? What lessons can we take from this period of history, I suppose, is what I'm asking you. And that's a big question, I appreciate.
Okay. As you say, Robert is a person who is not by nature violent and who has rejected his own history of violence in the Vietnam War. But when he has a pistol pointed at his head, he responds in the same way that you and I probably would, right? You try to defend yourself. And I can't give you a solution for that kind of conflict of one violent side against another violent side. But it's the struggle again between amnesty, justice, and amnesty, right? Between justice and mercy. You think of the Shakespeare play, Sherlock, The Merchant of Venice, right? It's something that Hemingway dealt with. But more than physical violence, Yvonne, I think what I am interested in and what it comes out in the novel is more the question of psychic violence.
Mm.
And Cesar Rocastillo is a person who has been violent physically, who believes in physical force, but the damage that he does to his own family, this kind of patriarchal, authoritarian personality, I try to show what it can do inside of a family, not only inside of a country. So here you have this very intelligent, powerful man who has a son that he more or less forced into the priesthood. And this son, a very handsome young man, a few years younger than Gabriela, has a stutter. And every time he mentions the word father, you think of, well, how can a priest avoid the word father, right? The Lord's Prayer, right? He stutters, right? So there's this physical, mental block that he has. And then Gabriela is also the victim of this personality of her father. I can't reveal right now. It would be a spoiler if I told you in what way, right? And his wife is a rather lively woman who has a vibrant personality when she's not in her husband's presence, but when she's in her husband's presence, she kind of wilts, right? So as I put it in one scene, Roca kind of sucks the energy or sucks the oxygen out of the air like a black hole. Wherever he is, he tends to do that. So I was much more interested in this kind of psychological and psychic violence rather than the question of physical violence, which everyone knows about. But I saw in my many months in Argentina examples of how this kind of authoritarian personality doesn't just end on the streets or in politics, in Congress, in the legislature, or in the military, but it has profound, lasting influences on people, on personalities. And that's what I saw in Argentina 6 years after the end of the war that really intrigued me and that I thought had not been explored enough in fiction.
Yeah, and I think he's almost a black hole in the sense that this Cesar, the sort of gravitational force of his personality and the psychic damage is a great term for it. The way he sort of sucks energy and exudes negativity to those around him. And I think interesting the way the personal and the political intersect there as well. Well, thank you so much for your answers, Ed. It's been great talking to you about Frail Blood. So we'll finish this section here, but please everybody join us for part 3 when Ed will give his recommendations for further reading. So looking forward to hearing what you have for us at that point.